All right, Ben Mankiewicz, host of season 6 of TCM's The Plot Thickens, which dives into the 1963 film Cleopatra. Ben, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate it.
So let's get one thing out of the way first for the audience, because I'm sure they recognize your last name. This is your uncle's film, so it's quite personal. First thing, did being so close to the film for all these years make any parts difficult to talk about?
No, it didn't make anything difficult to talk about. It made stuff surprising to talk about. It made perhaps the revelatory moments, and there were many for me. Um, uh, More emotionally resonant, certainly. This is my great uncle. I mean, he's my uncle. By the way, that was a significant debate. Is do we keep calling him my great uncle? But that's a weird way to tell a story, right? To keep saying your great uncle. And I'm like, well, great uncle's uncle. So we're going to just go with uncle. He's my grandfather's brother, Joe Mankiewicz, Joseph L. Mankiewicz. It was Cleopatra was, it was billed. It was among the first movies. I was always told it was the first to have the director above the title, but I doubt that's actually true. That's a sort of family lore, but it certainly wasn't normal. It wasn't William Wyler's Ben-Hur, right? I don't think it's going to turn out it was. And I'm going to look like an idiot, but and he was paid. I was told it was $1 million growing up. First director earned $1 million. It wasn't quite that, but they bought his production company to get him to do it. They bought his production company for a ridiculous price. So and Joe. Like it was the first time Joe had a phrase that didn't exist then, fuck you money, right? And he described it as like, did you do this for money? He was like, yeah, 100% act of whoredom. So, but it didn't mean he didn't try. And he tried. He arguably tried too hard and too diligently and was too committed to it. And even though Joe died in 93, so I was 26 years old, I didn't really know him, although I grew up in D.C. and he was in Bedford, New York, not far, and his youngest daughter was my age. Alex Mankiewicz, who played a really critical role in being in our ability to tell this story fully and completely, because she gave us his diaries and sort of, directed us directed us in interesting directions without ever trying to influence anything we said about her dad, who of course she loves. So I revered Joe professionally, but personally, I characterized, I turned him into a character. I caricatured him, excuse me, into sort of a professorial and the kind of guy who loved to point out when you were wrong and sort of deliberately, I use professorial because deliberately sort of talked over your head, a bad professor, right? The professor you don't want to take a course from. I never quite understood what he was saying. But it turns out that all of that was my own. That's just stuff I put on it without. I mean, my dad was close to him. My dad was great. So I don't know why I didn't think that meant Joe was great. He was funny, like so many other people in the family, and clever. And then he got hurt by this. This was tough on him, man. It really destroyed him. So it was, I wouldn't describe that as hard, but it was, like I said, it was revelatory. And I was pleased to have those revelations and have a much more complete human understanding of who Mankiewicz was.
Cleopatra is such a famous film, both for the actual movie, but also everything surrounding it. Health, affair scandals, anything you name it. What would you say the greatest misconception about the film is?
It's hard to say what the greatest is because there are a lot of misconceptions about the film. One, that it's terrible. It's not terrible. It's not great. Joe wanted 2-3 hour movies. It's a 4-hour movie. You don't watch it and you don't think, oh my God, what a disaster, right? You might think that was too long or some stuff didn't make sense. It actually is, now it would be a 8-hour limited series, and probably a really good one. That's what Joe would have loved that. It didn't bankrupt a studio. There was anxiety that if it made no money, I mean, if it brought in nothing, they spent the number mentioned a lot is 44 million. It's not like we're adding it up and it ever hit 44 million. But if you count everything together, it probably crossed 40 million in 1963, which is insane. 62, 63 when they were making it. And so if it had made $5 million back, maybe that would have bankrupted Fox. By 1965, Fox had The Sound of Music. By 1966, Cleopatra turned a profit. when it got sold to TV. So that's not that long. And it made like $20 million very quickly, which gave Fox enough operating expenses to continue with new slates of films and proceed as a studio. But it did put Fox in jeopardy. They sold the backlot. It's Century City, which has like one of the greatest outdoor malls in America. It was largely created because Fox sold the backlot right in the middle of LA. So yeah, but and that sort of Elizabeth Taylor's extravagances ruined the film. I mean, she ended up making, probably, hard to say exactly, but probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 million. She was supposed to get $1 million, but you count the overages, and she ended up getting $7 million. She didn't show up to work sometimes. Sometimes it was probably her own paranoia about her health. But this is a woman who arguably twice nearly died. And that's not disputed in the hospital, right? Before Cleopatra and then right at the beginning of its production, and was really sick. And so you sort of learn, like, yeah, maybe she was cautious when she felt bad, like, with legitimate reason. And also you read my uncle's diaries, a lot of people were sick, It was hard work and long schedules, and they're all, living in hotels, and people are coming into Rome for what's supposed to be 2 weeks and staying for 13, and, all not so much extras, but, minor characters are running up huge salaries because the things were delayed, so much so. But it wasn't Elizabeth's fault. She's a nice little addition. But I mean, if another director had Cleopatra and she'd had the same salary, and the other director had a producer who moved the production along, she was still going to make $4 or $5 million off this movie. So yeah, she didn't destroy it. And she was the only actress anybody wanted to play Cleopatra. So part of its success, and the reason that it got into the black pretty quickly, was because it had Elizabeth Taylor and this guy she fell in love with, Richard Burton.
Let's dive into your discoveries. What were some things that you already knew but wanted to dig deeper into?
Mostly it's the human part of it. Like, you think of Liz and Dick and the affair, and it's really, it's where we got the term paparazzi. It came from obviously a Fellini film, but a character paparazzo, but referring to what we now know as the paparazzi. Really started with Cleopatra. I mean, the first picture of Liz and Dick embracing, everybody wanted it. There was no confirmation of the affair, but everybody thought they were having it. It's funny, there were all these rumors of leaks in the production, but it took a photographer hiding under a car, shooting up, to get that first picture of them that confirmed they were both, stepping out on their spouses. And, and for Liz, it was the second time in very short period of time. But again, there's a human component to that. She probably should never have married Eddie Fisher, which involved taking Eddie Fisher from Debbie Reynolds, which was kind of a studio encouraged marriage also. I mean, they had kids, and Debbie wanted it desperately to work. And then Mike Todd, her husband, who was routinely described as the love of her life, and in the biographies would seem to support that was her strongest marriage, to that point anyway. And he died in a plane crash, and he was Eddie Fisher's best friend. So, yeah, they had an affair, and Debbie Reynolds, America's favorite girl next door, got hurt, but they were brought together by this intense grief. Like, it's sort of understandable, right? And then because they were brought together by this intense grief and then made the mistake of getting married, instead of just like being like, wait, this is a mistake, and getting away from each other, she fell in love with somebody else deeply, Richard Burton. There's no question they did. So it's a real affair. So they loved each other. And people know that, but still, when you think about it in terms of Cleopatra, you just think about, the nature of the affair and the frenzy, the first media frenzy about a whole production. So this affair was not, the studio people could not keep this affair out of the papers. And then, of course, they realized this was almost certainly helping them. And then this is somehow, because of all that, I think, because of the affair, because there was this carnal component to it that Americans loved to read about, the world loved to read about. This beautiful woman fell in love with this, strikingly sexy Welsh rogue. We got the first time really ever, you could go back through Variety and the Hollywood Reporter and find the trade papers talking about a film's budget, but not like this, not where newspapers routinely talked about a movie going over budget. Like they just wasn't no one thought this is going to be interesting to folks in Ohio, like, or in Fresno. That's not what people tended to read about, but this was the first movie that covered that. So the runaway production, that became a major storyline. So stuff I learned was that's all like that. You put these things together and not one thing caused this to get out of control. I'm struck that there was no strong producer on it. Walter Wanger was producing it, but he was certainly no longer a strong producer. He definitely had been. And maybe it was because it was in Rome and Joe was such a strong director, but nobody needed to, somebody needed to make it easy for Joe to make the movie. And, and then Joe's hubris kept him from hiring a writer who should have been there every day. I was sort of simultaneously, as I was working at the end of the Cleopatra podcast, I was working on a piece on the 50th anniversary of Jaws. And, Carl Gottlieb was there every day of the production. He would write, he'd come out with Steven and Spielberg and watch the shoot, and they'd figure out what they needed for tomorrow, and they'd write, change scenes then. And Joe wanted to write it, but he should have written it with somebody at night. Then when he needed to go to sleep, somebody should be like, okay, we've got ideas we discussed today. I'm going to go write these down. And he didn't have that. So he's taken basically downers to sleep and uppers to stay awake. And, and it was, in a shocking development that caught up with him. But he tried, man. He tried. You can tell from the diaries how deeply he cared about it. He may have taken it. He may have called it an act of whoredom. He went for the money, but then he was going to make the best movie he could, and he was determined to do that. I mean, he was shooting it at the end, as people will hear. One little giveaway from the last episode is they carried him out to shoot in the desert on a stretcher because he couldn't walk, because he'd taken a shot of dexedrine. I'm not sure still yet how to pronounce it. That was another inside podcast discussion. How do we say this? We figured it out, but I don't know. I can't remember what we figured out. But they gave him a shot and it hit his sciatic nerve, and he's getting shots of drugs in his butt. Like, it's just like, that's madness. So it broke him. It broke him in many ways emotionally. And he was a strong, tough dude and whose 60s should have been spent, getting lauded in France. And instead he spent the 70s, at least anyway. That's when he would have been lauded in France. But he spent, from the late 60s till his death in 1993 with writer's block. Like writer's block for about 20 years, where he couldn't answer correspondence. This guy wrote all about Eve.
It seems like there was so much pressure coming in all different directions. Where exactly was that pressure coming from? Was it the studio? Was it, the paparazzi just always being there? Where was all this coming from?
All of it. I mean, a giant production for which he really had no major help in corralling, while also having to do the artistic part and make the actual movie, right? I mean, when I started at TCM, one of the things, there were many things that made me think, oh my God, I don't know nearly enough about what I thought I knew plenty about. But one of it was that I still was, I'd always say to myself and other people, and trying to get a laugh, like I worked TCM, I still couldn't tell you what a producer does. Well, along the way, I've learned what a producer does, right? Well, first, it's weird because you see, everybody's seen a movie now. There's 18 producers in the beginning. One of those people produced the movie, right? Maybe two of those people produced the movie, but probably one. And that means, really, put simply, was in charge of everything that allowed the director to direct the movie, right? To focus on the task at hand of making the movie. The director runs the production, but there's a producer who deals with all the nonsense, most of the nonsense. Directors involve themselves some, and they probably should involve themselves in some. But Martin Scorsese explained it to me when I was doing a piece for CBS Sunday Morning on Irwin Winkler. That Irwin Winkler sort of, when he had to play the bad guy, Irwin Winkler was a bad guy, right? He was the guy who got yelled at by the studio. So Marty could make Raging Bull, right? And make it the way he wanted to, right? And convince the studio to come up with exactly the right amount of money and know where to go to get the rest of the money. And so the pressure came sort of from all these external forces that he knew everybody at Fox was nervous. He knew there was no other movie in production for much of Cleopatra at Fox, no other film. And they're not even at Fox. They're in Rome at Cinecittà. So the lot in Century City in the middle of LA was a ghost town, and everything did depend on Cleopatra, but of course then it worked. It actually made some money. It got a boatload Academy Award nominations, including Rex Harrison, who played Julius Caesar. So this was it was not in any way a failure, but the pressures were very real, and Joe felt them. Whether it was from they'd come out, of course they're complaining about the cost, and Joe's thinking, how am I going to shoot this next scene? And then they wanted it to just be done, which is again why. And then it's when Zanuck took over, when Daryl Zanuck took over, and clearly wanted to make himself be seen as the savior of the Fox and of the film and Fox. And Zanuck, of course, had been at Fox for forever and was their most famous head of production, and ran the studio, and pretty much ran the studio when he was head of production. And he came back after being an independent producer and making The Longest Day, and he came back, and then they shoot a documentary where he has himself up on the crane looking into the camera, and Joe standing off to the side, and they get the shot of him coming down. He comes down, gets off the crane, walks on, dramatically, and then they go, okay, now go direct the movie. But that's if you'll excuse me, a giant dick move. Like, you're not the director. You're not. So you can make a movie about yourself, and but that's not it. That's not, because it's not what a producer does. Because what a producer does is stand around and negotiate with people and keep everything running smoothly, which is critical for the success, in many cases, for the success of movies. Certainly there have been successful movies where there was tumult. But so he felt the pressure from Zanuck, and then Zanuck was like, no, you can't have 2 3-hour movies. You're going to have one movie. We need it out now. We need this. He didn't want to run the risk that if people knew there was another movie coming in 4 months, maybe they'd wait and they wouldn't see this one. Now the fact that a director said, hey man, do you want 2 3-hour movies here? Every studio exec would be like, you mean the stuff I've already paid for, you need me 2 movies? Yeah, great idea. But that didn't happen here. That was an understandable mistake of Zanuck's part, but it was a mistake, and Joe didn't have anybody to push for it correctly either.
Did you find anything that you maybe didn't know prior that was a discovery at the time when doing research and talking to people?
Oh, I mean, a thousand things. I mean, just from the number of people. I mean, this strikes me, the number of production delays that had nothing to do with whether Joe being the director in the beginning, whether Joe, whether it was Joe or whether it was the director before him, right? I mean, none of that was. So many things went wrong, totally out of their hands. I mean, from the storms and switching, whether they were going to shoot it on the back lot in Los Angeles or whether they were going to shoot it, a crazy decision to shoot it in London. Where they were like, it's supposed to be Rome, and there's, they're you can see their breath, right? And there's fog all the time. So, and then just again, the contemporaneous notes that Joe took, like just the daily slog of how difficult this was and how many days ended incredibly early. How little that first director, Ruben Mullion, got done. Like there was a couple of lines in there that people have that some of these have been quoted in the past, that like the one thing Ruben Mullion did not want, he was ready to do everything except shoot, right? What he didn't want to do was shoot the film, and he seemed pretty grateful to be able to get off it. And then just, and then the from my uncle's point of view, that in addition to all these things I'm talking about that he had to do, again, like, I don't know about you, but when I go to TCM to do a month's worth of scripts, I fly to Atlanta basically every month, and I'll go and over 3 days, I'll read 90 scripts, intros and outros. So 180 different segments, so like 60 a day. It's not the longest day in the world. I mean, 9 to sometimes 6:30. I go back to the hotel. I don't move for like 2.5 hours sometimes. And I'm not exaggerating at all. Like, I don't even eat. I don't go out with anyone. I don't do anything. I don't want to pick up the phone. I don't really sleep, but I'm like on the bed, frequently in my coat still and shoes, right? The notion that I then had to, and when I have to do something, when I have to write something, I'm in agony. And I have to write like kind of nonsense, right? I have to write little things that are, Joe had to write a screenplay. Like, it's insane, the pressure that was on him. So, and while all that is happening, Joe was a therapist to Rex Harrison to a limited extent, but not no extent at all. Eddie Fisher, while Eddie was still there, talking to him about, hey, my wife's falling in love with somebody else. I can wait and get her back. And when I hear she had a birthday, I'm going to get her a, extravagant present to win her back. And um, and uh, and then very much so to Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, like he was there. And so when he had to work at night, no, they'd come over and they'd talk about all that was going on in their lives. And he was very good. Joe was always somebody like a lot of people in my family, which I'm, proud of. Like when people were in trouble, they reach out, and they reached out to Joe, and he needed to say, "Yeah, I can't talk to you tonight. I I got stuff to do." So there were just so many little personal things from Burton and from Taylor and from Joe, and from Walter Wanger, who's a significant character in all this. That again, I some people know some of these things. Most people don't know any of them, and they all sort of conspired to put these people under this intense degree of pressure for making a movie, and everybody came out fine except my uncle, who was during the 1950s sort of the top writer director in town. Certainly one of the top two or three.
I want to finish up with having you kind of tease what season 6 of The Plot Thickens, what the audience can expect if they either haven't started it yet and are going to binge it later, or who listen to it as it releases. What can audiences expect to learn about the film Cleopatra?
There's never been a Hollywood production like this. The big ones that we know about in more modern times, like Waterworld, like Bonfire of the Vanities, the ones that have gone Ishtar, the ones that have gone famously off the rails, pale in comparison to what happened in Cleopatra. Cleopatra is the definitive story of a Hollywood production gone wrong. And there is no real villain. There's some, you can make studio executives minimal villains, but Elizabeth's certainly not the villain. I mean, she's very much the heroine who's blamed too much, and I think sort of becomes a fairly empathetic figure, if definitely caused some of her own problems, as Joe pointed out. But she came out of, she didn't suffer because of Cleopatra. Richard Burton didn't suffer because of Cleopatra. Rex Harrison didn't suffer because of Cleopatra. Daryl Zanuck didn't suffer because of Cleopatra. One person did, Joe. So that's part of it. And then Joe's redemption story is a long and mostly sad until it isn't. And to have someone of his talent, 4 Oscars in 2 years for my uncle, for Letter to Three Wives, writing and directing, then All About Eve the next year, writing and directing. To imagine that in the cinematic world that we live in today, it's inconceivable. Somebody's going to win writing and directing back-to-back years. But he got broken, and you want to see how a movie can break somebody, or hear about how a movie can break somebody. You'll hear it with audio that you haven't heard before, with diary entries you haven't heard before. Walter Wanger did an amazing thing. He wrote his diary at the time also, and then he recorded it like in the 60s. Why? But God bless him. Thank you, Walter Wanger, for being so considerate to us. So there's just, if you care about how movies are made, I guess it's not that interesting to hear about how smooth things went on, Taxi Driver. I don't know the offhand that they did, but when it goes wrong, and when there's an effort to fix it every day, to rein it in, and you can't do it, and it just gets bigger, and the tentacles get bigger, and you stop a couple of you stop a spread here, then tentacles break out somewhere else. It's an incredibly compelling story, and it has a nice little family component for me that I was really grateful to be able to tell. I was dubious at first, but quickly convinced of how good this would be, how compelling a story this would be to tell, and how useful it would be for me to tell it. And it was cathartic. I learned how to talk about my family in a way, in a psychologically stronger way than I had been.
That's amazing. Ben, thank you so much for your time. I love diving into these things, and I'm so excited for fans to listen to everything behind the scenes of Cleopatra. So thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for your interest in it. I really appreciate it, Michael. Great to talk to you. Great work. Thanks.